The audience was still laughing when the woman reached across the Family Feud podium and pulled the phone from her husband's hand. Her husband reacted instantly. Janet, no, but she was already walking toward Steve Harvey. Steve had been smiling only seconds earlier. Now he wasn't. The 62-year-old woman held the phone out to him with both hands. Her husband stood frozen behind her, his face tight with panic. Steve looked from the woman to the phone and then back toward the husband. "What exactly am I supposed to be looking at?" Steve asked. The woman swallowed. Her eyes were already wet. "Just read the last message." The studio became quiet. Steve took the phone. He looked down, read the message once, then again. His eyebrows slowly lifted. The smile disappeared completely, and for several seconds, Steve Harvey said absolutely nothing. The man at the podium lowered his head. His wife pressed her lips together, trying not to cry. The audience had no idea what Steve had just read, but they could tell from his face that the game they had been watching was no longer just a game. Finally, Steve looked at the husband. "You were willing to leave the show over this?" The man nodded. "Yes, sir." Steve looked down at the phone one more time. Then he turned toward the production booth, and what he said next changed everything. But to understand why one text message could stop an entire Family Feud taping, you have to understand why that phone mattered so much to the man who refused to give it up. His name was Walter Hayes. Walter was 64 years old. He and his wife Janet had been married for 41 years. They came from a small town outside Little Rock, Arkansas, where Walter had spent most of his adult life working for the electric company. Not behind a desk, Walter was a lineman. When thunderstorms knocked trees into power lines, Walter went out. When ice coated the roads and everyone else was told to stay home, Walter's truck was usually heading in the opposite direction. When tornado warnings came through, Janet knew what would happen before the phone even rang. Walter would pull on his work boots, grab his coat, kiss her goodbye, and leave. For almost 4 decades, Walter helped keep the lights on for families he would never meet. But that job came with a price. He missed birthdays. He missed school plays. He missed anniversaries. He once ate Thanksgiving dinner out of a plastic container inside a utility truck while repairing lines after a storm. His children grew up knowing that if the weather turned ugly, their father might disappear before dessert. Walter never complained about it. But there was one day he carried with him for more than 30 years. A day his family had forgiven long ago. Walter never had. It happened when Janet was pregnant with their second child. Their daughter Emily. A brutal ice storm had hit Arkansas overnight. Power lines were collapsing, transformers were blowing, and just before midnight, Janet went into labor. Walter drove her to the hospital himself. He walked her through the emergency entrance, held her hand, made sure the nurses had her. Then his work radio went off. Part of the hospital had lost power. The backup system was under heavy strain. Outside, crews were fighting to restore the main feeder line. Walter knew exactly what that meant. He looked at Janet. Janet looked at him. "You have to go," she said. Walter shook his head. "My daughter's being born." Janet squeezed his hand. "And somebody else's daughter is already in this hospital." Walter never forgot that sentence. He kissed his wife, then walked outside into freezing rain. For the next several hours, while Janet labored upstairs, Walter was outside with his crew restoring power to the hospital. Emily was born before he made it back inside. Healthy, loud, perfect, Walter saw her for the first time wrapped in a hospital blanket in Janet's arms. Everyone told him he had done the right thing. Janet told him, his co-workers told him. Years later, Emily herself told him. But Walter always came back to one sentence. "I wasn't in the room." Janet hated hearing him say it. "You were keeping the room lit," she would answer. Walter would smile. But he never fully believed her. 32 years passed. Emily grew up, moved to Seattle, got married, built a life, and eventually called her parents with news Walter had been waiting years to hear. She was pregnant. Their first grandchild. Walter became ridiculous about it. He bought baby clothes before they knew whether it was a boy or girl. He learned how video calls worked properly. He downloaded 3 different baby tracking apps and understood none of them. He called Emily every Sunday, sometimes twice. And when she entered her final month of pregnancy, Walter started sleeping with his phone on the nightstand at full volume. Then something else happened. The Hayes family finally got selected for Family Feud. Emily had been submitting the family for years. It was one of those running family jokes that eventually became serious. Every year she submitted another application. Every year Walter said the same thing. Steve Harvey doesn't want to meet this family. Emily would answer, Steve Harvey doesn't know what he's missing. Then the call finally came. The taping date was less than 3 weeks before Emily's due date. Walter immediately said no. Janet agreed. Their son Marcus agreed. Everyone assumed they would cancel. Emily refused to allow it. She called the family from Seattle. You are going. Walter said, baby, you're due in 3 weeks. I know when I'm due. What if something happens? Then I call you. I can't be in California while you're having my grandbaby. Emily laughed. Dad, you spent 32 years feeling guilty because you were outside a hospital when I was born. I am not letting you miss something else because you're afraid of missing me. Walter went quiet. Emily continued. You're going on that stage. Mom is going. Marcus is going. Aunt Denise is going. And if you meet Steve Harvey, please do not do that terrible impression you do of him. Walter laughed despite himself. But Emily was serious about one thing. Go. Eventually, they agreed. 2 days before the taping, everything changed. At 3:48 in the morning, Walter's phone rang. Emily's husband, Daniel. Emily's water had broken. Early, Walter sat upright in bed. Janet was awake before he even spoke. They were already in California. Emily was in Seattle. Walter's first instinct was immediate. We're going home. Emily refused. She called him herself from the hospital. Her voice was tired but steady. Dad, don't you dare. Walter almost shouted. You're in labor. I noticed. We're coming home. No, Emily, Dad. Listen to me. He stopped. The doctors are calm. Daniel is here. Everything is okay. It could still take hours, maybe longer. I don't care. I do. Walter said nothing. Then Emily said something that brought him back to that frozen hospital parking lot 32 years earlier. You spent my whole life thinking you weren't there when I was born. Walter looked down. Emily, you were there, Dad. You were outside keeping the hospital running. But I know you still don't believe that. Walter's eyes filled. Emily continued. So tomorrow you are going to stand in that room. Walter knew what she meant. The Family Feud stage. No parking lot this time, she said. No standing outside because of me. Go play. Walter finally agreed. But he made one condition. His phone stayed with him. Daniel would send updates. Every change, every doctor update, every development. One phone, one text thread. Walter would not miss it. And that agreement created a problem the moment the Hayes family arrived backstage for Family Feud. Contestants were told to leave personal phones off stage. Everyone complied, except Walter. A production assistant held out a collection pouch. Walter shook his head. I need to keep this. The assistant smiled politely. I'm sorry, sir. Phones can't go onto the stage. Walter nodded. I understand. But he didn't hand it over. A producer came over. Then another. They explained that filming could not be interrupted. Walter understood. They explained that rules applied equally to everybody. Walter agreed. Then they asked again for the phone. Walter said no. Janet watched her husband becoming more anxious by the minute. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He just kept touching his jacket pocket to make sure the phone was there. Finally, a producer said, Mr. Hayes, if you absolutely cannot surrender the phone, we may have to remove you from the taping. Walter immediately nodded. That's fine. Janet stared at him. Marcus stared at him. The producer looked confused. You're willing to leave? Yes, ma'am. After your family came all this way? Yes, Walter looked at his wife. They can play without me. Janet knew why. But she also knew something else. 32 years earlier, Walter had stood outside a hospital because he believed that was where duty required him to be. Now he was preparing to walk out of another important room. Again, for Emily. Janet was tired of watching him do that. The producers eventually decided to let Steve address it before filming properly got underway. When the family reached the stage, the audience could tell immediately that something unusual was happening. Steve Harvey walked toward the Hayes family. He looked at Walter, then at Walter's jacket, then back at Walter. "I'm hearing you have something on you that apparently everybody in this building wants." The audience laughed. Walter gave a nervous smile. Steve held out his hand. "Phone." Walter didn't move. The audience laughed again, assuming it was part of the joke. Steve stared at him. "You know, normally when I say that, folks hand me the phone." Walter nodded. "I know, Mr. Harvey." Steve extended his hand farther. Walter still didn't move. Now the laughter started fading. Steve lowered his arm. "You serious?" "Yes, sir, why?" Walter looked toward Janet, then down. "I can't explain it." Steve tilted his head. "You can't explain why you're breaking the rule?" "No, sir." "Then help me understand something. You came all the way here to play Family Feud, and I'm told you were willing to walk out rather than give up that phone." "Yes, sir." Steve's expression changed. "So whatever is on that phone matters more to you than being on this stage?" Walter answered instantly. "Yes." The audience became completely silent. Steve looked at him for several seconds. Walter's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket pocket. And that was when Janet decided enough was enough. She stepped toward her husband. Walter looked at her. "Janet." She reached into his jacket. "Janet." "No." She pulled the phone out. Walter grabbed gently for her wrist. "We promised Emily." Janet looked directly at him. "She told you not to miss the room." Walter froze. Janet walked away from the podium, straight toward Steve Harvey. The entire audience watched her. Steve looked confused. Janet stopped in front of him and held out the phone. "Mr. Harvey." Steve took it. "What am I reading?" "The last message." Walter lowered his head. Janet's voice shook. "Then you decide whether he should have kept the phone." Steve looked at the screen. The conversation was open. A thread between Walter and his son-in-law. The most recent message had arrived less than an hour earlier. Steve read it. His expression changed immediately. He looked at Walter, then back at the screen. He read it one more time. The message said, "Tell Dad everything is okay. They think the baby may come today. Emily says you are not allowed to leave that stage because of her. Tell him exactly this. Dad, you kept the lights on when I came into the world. Today I'll keep the phone on while you have your moment. Stay in the room this time. I love you." Steve stopped reading. Nobody in the audience knew exactly what was on the screen, but they could see Steve swallowing hard. He looked at Janet. "Your daughter is having a baby?" Janet nodded. "Right now." The audience reacted all at once. Steve turned toward Walter. "And she told you to stay here?" Walter nodded. "She made me promise." Steve stared at the phone, then at Walter. "And you were about to leave rather than explain that?" Walter's voice cracked. "She said not to make a fuss." Steve slowly looked toward the audience. "This man's daughter is in labor right now." Gasps moved through the room. "She is having his first grandchild. And apparently she is more worried about him missing this show than she is about herself." A few people laughed through tears. Then Steve turned back to Walter. "What did she mean about you keeping the lights on?" Walter looked uncomfortable. Janet answered for him. "When Emily was born, the hospital lost power during an ice storm." Steve's smile vanished again. Walter was a lineman. Janet told him the story. How Walter had driven her to the hospital, how the emergency call came, how he had gone outside into freezing rain, how he helped restore power while his daughter was being born upstairs, how he had spent more than 30 years believing that he had missed her birth. Walter stared at the floor through most of it. Steve listened without interrupting. When Janet finished, Steve looked at Walter. "You think you missed your daughter being born?" Walter nodded. "Yes, sir." Steve shook his head. "No, you didn't." Walter looked up. Steve pointed toward him. "You were outside keeping the lights on." The audience applauded. Walter tried to smile. Steve wasn't finished. Man, there were babies in that hospital. Sick people, doctors, nurses, your wife, your daughter. Somebody had to make sure that building had power. Walter's eyes were wet now. Steve looked down at the phone again. And now the same daughter is telling you to stay in the room. Walter nodded. Steve turned toward the production booth. Put that phone right here. A crew member approached. Steve pointed to the top of the family podium. No, don't take it away. He looked at Walter. Put it on the podium. Walter stared at him. Steve handed the phone back. Ringer all the way up. The audience started cheering. Walter hesitated. Steve pointed at him. You heard me. Full volume. Walter turned the sound on. Steve looked toward the cameras. Now I'm saying this once. He pointed at the phone. If that phone rings, he pointed toward the band. You stop. He pointed toward the board. You stop. Then toward the audience. Y'all stop. Finally, Steve pointed at himself. And I stop. The applause exploded. Steve put his hand on Walter's shoulder. Your daughter told you to stay in the room. Then, Steve smiled. So, stay in the room. That was the moment the entire game changed. The phone was no longer a problem. It became part of the show. Every person in the studio was now waiting for the same thing. The game began, and strangely, once Walter knew the phone could stay, his entire personality changed. The nervousness disappeared. He started laughing. He gave Steve a terrible answer in the first round. Steve stared at him. Walter grinned. Steve said, "So this the man keeping the electricity on?" The audience laughed. "'Cause that answer just turned every light in here off." Even Walter laughed. Janet was strong throughout the game. Marcus played well. Aunt Denise gave one answer so bad that Steve had to walk away from the podium before he could continue. And through all of it, the phone sat there, silent. Every few minutes, Walter glanced at it. The camera occasionally caught him checking the screen. Once, during a commercial break, Steve walked over. "Anything?" Walter checked. "No, sir," Steve nodded. "All right." By the third round, the audience had joined in. Someone shouted, "Any baby yet?" Walter laughed. "Not yet." The whole crowd groaned playfully. Then halfway through the next round, the phone buzzed. Steve stopped before Walter even touched it. "Hold it." The audience fell silent. Walter read the message. His face relaxed. Steve asked, "Good news?" Walter nodded. "Everything is fine." Still waiting. The audience applauded. Steve smiled. "Okay," Baby said, "keep playing." They continued, and the Hayes family somehow made it all the way to the final round. Walter and Marcus were chosen for fast money. Marcus went first. He scored 98 points. Not bad. Now Walter needed 102. Before he stepped forward, he looked at the phone. Still silent. Steve noticed. "She's okay." Walter nodded. "I know." Steve leaned closer. "Then go make that grandbaby some money." Walter laughed. The clock started. Steve asked, "Name something a person might drive all night for." Walter answered, "Family." "Good answer." "Name something people lose sleep over." "A baby." The audience reacted. Steve paused for half a second. Then continued. "Name something people are afraid to miss." Walter looked toward the phone. "A call." Steve looked at him. The audience murmured. "Final question. Name the best news someone can receive." Walter didn't hesitate. "Everybody's okay." "Time." The audience erupted. Steve placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "Man, you answered every question like you got somewhere else you want to be." Walter smiled. "I do." They revealed the points. Family, top answer. Baby, strong answer. A call, top answer. The total climbed. 130, 154, 182. Walter needed 18 more. Steve revealed the final answer. Everybody's okay. 28 points. 210. They had won. The stage exploded. Music, lights, confetti. Janet ran toward Walter. Marcus shouted. Steve grabbed Walter's shoulders. $20,000. The family was screaming. And then, through all that noise, a ringtone started. Walter froze. Steve froze. Janet turned. The phone was ringing, not buzzing. Ringing a video call. The audience realized what it meant almost instantly. The cheering collapsed into silence. Steve spun toward the production booth. Stop. The music stopped. The lights steadied. Confetti continued drifting down. Steve pointed at the phone. That's the call. Walter's hands were shaking so badly that Janet had to help him answer it. Daniel appeared on the screen. His face was wet with tears. Walter's voice broke. Is she okay? Daniel smiled. They're both okay. Walter shut his eyes. Janet began crying. The audience applauded. Steve put both hands on his head. Then Daniel turned the camera. Emily was lying in a hospital bed. Exhausted, smiling, and wrapped against her chest was a tiny newborn baby girl. Walter completely broke. He covered his face. Janet wrapped an arm around him. Steve stepped closer to the phone. Emily smiled weakly. Hi, Dad. Walter tried to answer. Nothing came out. Emily laughed. I told you not to leave. Walter finally managed. I should have been there. Emily's expression changed. Dad. Walter looked at the screen. No, she shook her head. Not this again. Walter wiped his face. Emily continued. You have spent 32 years telling yourself you missed the day I was born. Walter's shoulders dropped. Emily looked directly into the camera. You didn't. Walter started crying harder. You were outside keeping the lights on. The audience was completely silent. Emily adjusted the baby in her arms. Mom told me that story my whole life. Walter looked at Janet. Emily continued. You think I grew up thinking my father wasn't there? She shook her head. I grew up knowing my father was the reason the hospital stayed lit. Walter covered his mouth. And today, Emily said, I wanted you somewhere else. She smiled. Because you have spent your entire life leaving rooms to take care of everybody else. Steve looked down. Even he was wiping at his eyes now. Emily lifted the baby slightly. So I wanted you to stay in one. Walter laughed through the tears. Then Emily said, Dad, meet your granddaughter. Walter leaned toward the phone. What's her name? Emily looked at Daniel. Then back at her father. Lucy. Walter smiled. Lucy? Emily nodded. It means light. Walter stopped breathing for a second. Janet broke down beside him. Emily's voice cracked. We thought it fit. Steve turned away for a moment. The audience erupted into applause. Walter looked at the newborn on the phone screen. Lucy, Emily smiled. And Dad? Yes, baby? You didn't miss this one either. Walter closed his eyes. No, Emily smiled. You're in the room. For several seconds, nobody on the Family Feud stage said anything. Steve finally looked toward Walter. You hear your daughter? Walter nodded. Steve pointed at the phone. That message you were trying to hide from us. Walter laughed. Steve continued. That message changed this whole game. The audience applauded. Steve looked toward Emily on the phone. And young lady, I need you to know something. Emily smiled. What? Steve pointed toward Walter. This man tried to quit my show because you were having a baby. Emily laughed. That sounds like him. I'm serious. He was ready to walk right out. I know. Steve shook his head. You Hayes people are exhausting. The studio laughed. Then Steve looked at the newborn. But I'll tell you what. His expression softened. Lucy picked one heck of an entrance. The applause returned. Steve turned toward Walter. 32 years you thought you were outside the room. Walter nodded. Steve pointed toward the phone. Your daughter just told you otherwise. He paused. Believe her this time. Walter looked at Emily, then at Janet, and finally nodded. I will. The show eventually continued long enough for the Hayes family to collect their winnings. But nobody cared much about the scoreboard anymore. The $20,000 was real. The victory was real. But the moment everyone remembered was a phone sitting on a Family Feud podium because one stubborn grandfather refused to let it out of his sight, and one wife finally decided that the promise her husband needed to keep was not the promise to stay quiet. It was the promise to stay on the stage, to stay in the room, to allow himself, For once, to be present for something beautiful without believing he had to be somewhere else taking care of everybody. And it all started with one message: "Dad, you kept the lights on when I came into the world. Today I'll keep the phone on while you have your moment. Stay in the room this time." Sometimes the message that changes everything doesn't reveal a scandal. It doesn't expose a lie. It doesn't destroy a marriage. Sometimes it does something much harder. It tells someone who has spent half a lifetime carrying guilt that they can finally put it down. Walter Hayes had spent 32 years believing he missed his daughter's first moments. His daughter spent one text message reminding him that love is not measured only by who stands beside the bed. Sometimes love is 60 feet away, in freezing rain, holding the lights on. And this time, when another baby entered the family, Walter wasn't outside, he wasn't in a parking lot, he wasn't driving toward a storm. He was standing under bright studio lights, surrounded by his wife, his son, Steve Harvey, and an audience of strangers, watching his granddaughter open her eyes for the first time. This time, Walter finally believed what his family had been trying to tell him for 32 years. He had always been in the room,